And hello again, this is Alan. For the part 2 of the two-part tutorial, I was talking about how am I processing my galactic center shots that I took in Utah in June 2016, so about 2 months ago. In the previous tutorial that I posted above, we talked about how I use the apps, PhotoPills or the Photographer's Ephemeris or Starwalk 2 to look at the night sky on location live to determine what is where in the sky. It's a very good aid to help you prepare and set the camera up to where it captures what you want it to capture. All that said, I am going to skip over the compositing in of the foreground shot. I want to concentrate, number one, on the night sky. So how do I process the night sky? And number two, how do I process the night sky when I'm still on the road? So this would typically be a night sky processing for social media, not necessarily to print in a high resolution framed print. That is the subject for a completely different tutorial because it's much more involved and there's more Photoshop work involved than what I'm showing here. But this is a very nice little trick that I've actually learned from a tutorial that I watched by Elia Locardi. It's called Photographing the World. Get into Capture One. Okay, so here is the shot that I chose to work on. And as you can see, the foreground is rather dark because this was captured at around 1 o'clock in the morning on 6/27 this year. It was in Utah. I was basically on a overlook just north of which one was it? One of the national parks. And I was actually, the RV was actually parked in Monticello at an RV park. So that was my kind of my home base. And then I would take the Jeep with the tent and go to this overlook. And this is essentially looking to the south. And you have the galactic center here, the Milky Way, and it's a very, very dark area. Now there is, when you see here, there's a little bit of light pollution coming in from here. And that is basically Monticello. From over here. So there's a little bit, even there where it's so dark, there's a little bit light pollution still observable. And as you can see, I took this as an f4 because I only had the 16 to 35 millimeter lens, which the lowest aperture is f4. So the biggest opening is f4. The shutter speed was at 25 seconds and the ISO is at 3200. So this is straight out of camera. The only things that I have done to this so far is as I am ingesting these photos into Capture One, After Photo Mechanic adds, all the IPTC, etc. information. Once I load it, I took a preset. I think Lightroom calls it preset. Capture One actually calls it styles because it has a preset is a one tool setting, whereas styles is a combination of presets, so multiple different areas. So one thing is it takes out the distortion from the lens, as you can see here. So that's sitting at 100%. So if I turn that off, I don't know if you can see a lot of difference there, but so basically, we go back to 100% where it was. Let's see, I'll just type 100. There you go. So that's basically, that helps with, on a wide angle lens, that helps take out the distortion. The barrel distortion or the pincushion distortion or whichever it is that your lens has. The other thing that is applied as I ingest is basically like my standard settings for shots that I do with the Alpha 7R Mark II, my Sony camera. And that is, I add about 5 contrast, 10 saturation, and then I add a little bit of clarity and structure, 8 and 4. So that's kind of like my standard setting. Everything else is basically standard setting that Capture One applies. I haven't changed any of those. So with this being, if you want straight out of camera with minimum settings or styles set up, the first thing I do when I have stars like this, I go into my, in Capture One, it's the color, this is the color panel. And in the color panel, you have something called color balance. So you could actually take this and you can, fashion photographers love this because you can change the colors and emphasize some and take some away. But there's also a cool thing here, and that is the luminance. So you can actually change the luminance, the global luminance of the photo. And what I'm doing is I'm basically taking, because this is a star photograph and I want the stars to pop, I take the luminance and I put it all the way up. So this is, see how this gets dark, and when I push this here, this slider, and I take the luminance all the way up, see how those stars start popping. So that's pretty much when I do prints, I do more in Capture One to prepare for Photoshop. But for here, let's say this is all we need, this is all we want to do. So I just increased the luminance of the highlights. That's the only thing I did. Once I have done all that, okay, let me go back in. So here you see there's my star trails, that the photos for the star trails, and there's some more photos of the Milky Way. But then what I do is I basically say edit with. Now I have a shortcut for that, and the nice thing about Capture One is that you can actually change the shortcuts to your liking, and my shortcut for this is Command E for edit. And so it takes the photo, okay, which is at this point it's still a raw photo. It's an ARW, so it's raw, and all the changes that I've done so far are easily reversible within Capture One. But now I'm doing the raw conversion. I'm going to make it into a TIFF, uncompressed. The profile continues to be ProPhoto. The resolution and everything is in, and then it will be opened in Adobe Photoshop. So when I hit edit the variant, and let me close this in the background here, we don't need that open. It is now creating the variant, so it's raw converting, and it's opening in Photoshop. Let's make that full screen. There we go. Maybe even make Photoshop full screen. There we go. Okay, so now we have our the same photo, just a TIFF in Photoshop. And so for a star sky like this, or a starry sky like this, usually I would now composite the foreground in and then create, different groups over here in my layers. And so I would have a group that's called the foreground, and then I have another group that's called the background, and I would have the same mask. So I create a foreground mask, and that's typically takes some time to get that right. And once that mask is created, I just create a second group and I call that the sky, and then I take that same mask that I created for the foreground and invert it for the background. So everything I do then, everything I'm showing you now would actually be done within that sky group that I created with that mask. So none of that would apply to the foreground. At least until the very end, when I might do some global changes to meld the two together a little better. So with all that said, like I said, we're not going into the foreground at all. So let's just assume the foreground is not really a concern of ours. We're just concerned with the night sky at this point. And again, that's probably what you get the most out of right now is to just look at the night sky and how do you get that night sky popping. So one of the easiest ways for me to do that is usually just go into Nik Color Efex Pro, and within Color Efex Pro for night skies, because of the higher ISO, you don't want to do too much contrast, because the more you mess with the contrast in your image, the more you will get the noise to show. So the first thing I do is Pro Contrast, and that's pretty much the only thing I do. So on the Pro Contrast, we want to start having these colors pop a little more. So we do that by adding some dynamic contrast. And as you can see, this pops already. So maybe, let's say 36, so about 2/3, 36%, 37%, something there, like that. Let's see, what does this? Yeah, see, that's bad when you correct the contrast. So you want to probably keep that low, maybe between 1 and 5%. The color cast, we don't need to worry about that because I set that specifically to a color temperature of 3500 Kelvin when I started. And so now look, this is what we started with, and this is what we get by just really changing a little bit of the dynamic contrast. And there's other ways to change dynamic contrast. You can do it in Photoshop, you can do it in ON1, you can use Intensify Pro from MacFun. So there's multiple different ways to get to this that you can use with other tools other than Nik. The nice thing about Nik is that it's free now, so anybody can download it. And at some point, it probably will stop working with the changes in operating systems, the changes in Photoshop. At some point, you might find that it doesn't work anymore because Google isn't working on developing changes to it anymore. So, but as long as it's still working, I know why reinvent the wheel when you can do it easily. So the other thing is that, and this is a trick that I, again, learned from Elia Locardi, and that is that, you know, on the night sky, you would never use a polarizer when you actually take the photo. However, when you're looking at the filter, it's actually doing interesting things. So look at when I add, let's go to maybe 100, 120%. That's typically a good number for night skies. So there, now watch. With polarization, without polarization, with, without. It's subtle, but because it's subtle, the difference is nice. It pops the colors, it differentiates somewhat between the colors. And so let's leave it at 120% and just say okay. So there we go. That was the first one. That was a very easy, very simple trick to get from our starting point here to, with just this one layer, to this. So you can see the Milky Way, the galactic center, is already popping a little bit. However, with the popping, I don't know if I can reach this. Let's see here. So with that popping, as you can see, we're also now seeing the noise. As you can see here in the stars, and then here in the light pollution, you can see that there's definitely noise, right? And that noise is going to be getting worse and worse as we continue to process this photo. So that's why when it comes to night skies, when it comes to high ISO, you want to keep your processing to as little as possible, especially when it comes to things like increasing contrast or increasing sharpness, because it's just going to aggravate the noise. So the next thing that I usually do now would be I would do some smoothing or softening, which is basically what noise reduction is. Noise reduction is, at the end of the day, just smoothing out things. And as you can see, the default setting here doesn't do anything. So what we want to do is we want to do a manual. Okay, and you can see here is with just this one. So you can see that's the original with the noise. That's smoothed out a bit. Okay, let's do another one. There. And let's measure it again. And as this processes. Okay, so here you see that's with the noise. That's smoothed out without the noise. Okay, so let's just hit OK. And this is going to be disappointing, to say the least, I'm sure. So here, there you go. As you can tell, we went from this with noise to this without noise. Now, what I think looks great is the Milky Way. It makes this like very smooth, very creamy. It's, you know, the colors get like splayed out a little more versus this. However, we're also losing a lot of the stars, a lot of the luminosity of some of the stars, and then some of those stars we are losing completely. They got completely washed out with the background. Because let's face it, random stars like that look to the program to define, which is the noise reduction program in Nik Color Effects Pro. They look like noise. So because they look like noise, they get washed out. They get eliminated because that's what the program does. It washes out the noise, eliminates the noise. And again, remember, in our real compositing version, the front here would not be affected because we would be working this in the group that has the layer mask of just the sky. But because we like the Milky Way, because the colors are nice and smooth now and they pop nicely, what we can do is we can do a little trick. So let's go, and again, this is a trick from Malaya Lacardi, and it is absolutely fantastic. You'll love it when you see what happens. Okay, so I take the layer, the define layer, and I turn it off. So we're back to our noisy picture. I choose that layer, the previous layer, okay? So we're now back to where we were before we applied any noise reduction. And now let's go here. Okay, now we're in the channels. And here in the channels, what we're going to do is we're going to use the RGB channel, which is basically the luminosity channel. When we use the luminosity channel and we select that, okay, now we have the luminosity channel selected, and I'm going to just create a layer out of it. There. Okay. Now we have this alpha channel, and in the alpha channel you see what we have chosen now in this luminosity mask is the highlights. Well, what is the brightest things in the sky? Well, it's the stars. And since we did that on the pre-noise reduced layer, we have all the stars that were there. We can see them. However, we're also getting some other things here, like the tree here on the side. The noise pollution is there. So on this alpha channel, what I want to do is I'm going to use a mask. So I mean curves. And so when I use curves, I'm going to what is commonly referred to as clamp. Okay, so I'm going to take the bottom and the top, and I'm basically going to get just the things that I want. So see here, we're getting rid of some of this over here. Okay, now we're applying this, and now we're going to copy this alpha channel, and then we're going back to the layers, turn this one back on, and hit. There we go. Okay, and I think I mistakenly, yep, there we go. No, I was right. This is wrong, because there we go. So basically, when I look at this mask, okay, when I look at this mask now, here is without, here is with, without, and with. And see, the stars are still subdued, but what you also see when I turn the mask off, see, this is without the mask on the layer, and this is with the mask on the layer. You can see our stars, a lot of the stars have popped back in. Now, while the sky is still a little less starry than, or the intensity of the stars is still a little less than what it was originally, we also don't have the noise and the stars are back. So basically what we're doing now is we are applying the noise reduction on everything but the brightest elements. So the noise reduction is everywhere but in the stars. And that's really what we want. So we got our stars back and we have the noise reduced sky. So if we go in and take a look closer up, as you can see, okay, now with the noise, you can see the noise in the sky, and now here, see how smooth it is? The noise is pretty much gone. Not in the noise, in the light pollution down here. Watch without. See the noise, and now with. And the noise is pretty much gone. And again, this is not necessarily the, you know, what I would stick to if I was going to print this. I would probably do more things to this on the noise reduction side if I printed it. But for social media, this much noise reduction is plenty. So now we have our noise reduced. We have the stars back, at least as much as we can. So the next one, bringing in some more color and some more contrast in the sky. And to do that, I'm going to just use a layer with curves, or a curves layer. Okay, and the way I do the curves layer, now I don't want to mess with anything down here. So we leave down here alone the shadows, but we're gonna clamp down the highlights. See how we can make that pop? Now this is too much, obviously. This is like a neon sign of the galactic center, and I've seen some on Flickr like that. I don't like that much. So let's go to where we like it. Okay, we just want to go enough to make these pop a little overall. Okay, there. And now let's just duplicate this layer. Okay, and on this one we're going a little more, maybe not too much. Okay, like that. Okay, let's see. So yep, let's go to there, but we're going to invert this mask. There we go. Okay, so now what we've done here is not interfering with anything. And then we take a brush. Okay, maybe a 10% flow. Nice and feathered. And I'm just going to paint in the areas that I want to pop a little more right around the galactic center and up here. Okay, there we go. With the 10% flow, I can go over it a couple of times and I can adjust as much as I want. Okay. Now that we have done that, you see, okay. Now I could go back and I could adjust the curves a little more if I wanted to. If I think that this is too much, well, I can take some out again because it might be too neon-y. There we go. How's that? So now let's see what we got ourselves from. So we started here and we are now here. So as you can see, the sky is noise reduced, the galactic center is popping, and basically I think we're almost where we want to be. Now, if you want to go further, now would be the time where you would go beyond the foreground and the background. So the foreground would be, you know, your high definition, low ISO, f8, f11 type, very crisp foreground with all the details. That's where you would want to apply. Within that folder, you would apply your sharpening, typically a high pass filter sharpening, and then, you know, you wouldn't do anything like that to the sky. And then the sky, you're pretty much done. Now what you want to do as a last step, especially when you're going to print, and sometimes even when you're going to post this on like Instagram or Facebook or Google Plus, is you probably want to make sure that the photo is balanced. So the foreground and the background, when it comes to crispness and contrast, well, crispness, obviously the crispness is going to be much higher in the foreground than it is in the sky, which that's fine, but you want to have that, the layer between the two, you want to have that be natural, and you want the contrast to be balanced between the two areas. So what you would do as a final step, usually when you have a composite like that, you would take this and add another global adjustment curves layer, and then you would use that global adjustment curves layer to create an S curve, possibly, you know, by clamping down highlights and shadows, and then create more of your contrast that way in the picture to where it's nicely balanced. You can even use a luminosity mask that just works on the midtones if you want, or you do one for the shadows and highlights, and then you do another one for the midtones to balance those out. Again, those are things that, you know, when you print or when you are very picky about how you want to post on social media, you would go to. But for the tutorial, I think I've done long enough on your time. So again, let's go back to the first, what we started, which all this had applied straight out of camera was essentially the highlight luminosity increased in Capture One, and then some minor standard stuff applied in Capture One, like lens correction, etc., and raw sharpening and so on. And then, you know, by adding color effects, we went to this. That's basically just adding pro contrast and some polarization. Then we added the noise reduction with the little trick on using a highlight luminosity mask to where we just apply the noise reduction in between the stars, not on the stars themselves, so that we get those stars back. Then we created a general curves layer. And again, this would be a general curves layer in the sky group to get the sky itself, give it a little more, how should I say, contrast, and make the colors pop. And then, if you want to get the colors more poppy on the Milky Way itself, we can do that by another curves layer that we then paint just the Milky Way in. So there. And that is a final photo that you could then post on your social media, Instagram, Facebook, etc. And basically, I think, from where we started to where we have come, it's a subtle change, but I think the change makes the picture, makes the sky pop much more than it would if it was just straight out of camera. So hope this was interesting and helpful for everybody. And I may get into more detail on how I process something like this with a composite for like a high resolution print, large print. And I will probably also go into how I process star trails one of these days, because I don't do long exposures on those. I do 30-second exposures and then just use Photoshop and put the different 30-second exposures into different layers and then just add them together with a twist. So anyhow, that should be it for now. I hope this was informative, and I hope you all didn't fall asleep. Thanks, and check back later.